Today we'll be discussing the importance of research, the impact of COVID on research and research plans, and also a bit about inspections in the autumn term and how that will inform future practice. Daniel, it would be great if you could start off by sharing us a bit about your background pre-Ofsted and also why research is so important to you.
Okay, so before I joined Ofsted, I was an academic. So I worked as a professor of education at the University of Southampton, and before that I worked at a number of other universities, Manchester, Newcastle, and so on. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not originally from England. I've lived for about 20 years, but I come from Belgium.
Right.
You asked me why research is important. Well, to me, that is about making sure that whatever we do, we try and base it on the best evidence we have that's going to help children learn, help children thrive. And of course, research in education is not kind of an exact science. It's not the case that you can just look at the research and say, okay, this is going to work in all cases. We will always be confronted with the fact that classrooms, schools and children are complex. Every context is different. So we'll always have to look at the research and kind of translate that into what's going to work in my school, in my classroom, in my context. But some people have said, what that means is that, well, you can find evidence that things work in different places, but you can't ever be sure. And that's true. But to me, that doesn't mean we shouldn't use research, because what it allows us to do is it allows us to make better bets. It's a little bit like, say you're betting on a football game.
Antwerp FC by any chance?
That would be a very good example to give, yes. So that is indeed my team. But if we were, going to put a bet on Antwerp FC against, let's say, Liverpool. Of course, we don't know what the outcome of that game is going to be, and we can't know that. However, we do have evidence we can draw on. And I would say, regrettably, that if I put my money on Liverpool, I'm probably going to have a better chance of winning my bet than if I put my money on Antwerp. But it's not certain. Antwerp could win, you never know. That's a little bit true in, I think, education as well. Research is not going to give us the definitive answer, and is not going to tell us for sure that something's going to work, but it's going to massively increase my odds if I build on what we already know and what we've already found. So to me, using research is actually kind of a moral purpose, because if we don't use research-based practice, we are potentially using less effective, less efficient methods, and we are therefore letting down the children and young people that we are here to serve. Also, what I would say there is that we know that schools and teachers make a greater difference for kids from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. So therefore, it's also a social justice issue, because if we improve the quality of our education, the quality of our teachers, the quality of our leadership, that's going to help the kids from the most disadvantaged backgrounds more than it's going to help anyone else.
Wow, you packed a lot into that introduction.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. And would it be fair to say that Ofsted's focus has intensified on research in recent years?
I think that's true. I think what we are trying to do as an organization is making sure that we are evidence-based, so that we build our own processes, build our own frameworks on the best available evidence. We want to make sure we are looking at the right things. That's obviously crucially important to us. And Amanda Spielman, when she became Chief Inspector, made a very strong commitment to making sure we are evidence-based and doing that. In part, that's related to kind of the function of research at Ofsted. Ofsted, of course, is not a university or a research center or anything like that. Our research has to be useful for us as an inspectorate, and be useful for us in terms of our purpose of improving quality of education, social care, informing Secretary of State about the state of the remits that we inspect, and so on. So it's a purpose-driven activity, and it has a number of specific intended outcomes. So one of the things that we try to do is make sure that we that we are looking at the right things, so that we draw on the research evidence to develop our frameworks. An example of that is, of course, the development of the education inspection framework, where we actually first did quite a large-scale literature review, looking at the evidence on educational effectiveness, and kind of put that next to the criteria of the existing framework to see whether we were looking at the right kind of things.
Okay.
Secondly, we then undertook a large-scale process of research into curriculum, because that lies at the heart of EIF, as you know. And what we are doing and are going to do in future is evaluate then how well the framework's actually working. So we try to build in that research throughout the process. So it's about looking at the right things. It's also about doing so in the right way. So making sure that the methods we use are as valid and reliable as they can be. So to do that, again, I'm going to give the example of EIF. We did a piece of work on lesson observation. We trialed the deep dive methodologies in our curriculum research, and so on. So it's about making sure that what we do actually works and gets us the information that we need. I think it's probably fair to say that those things have become even more important with EIF, because we moved away from this primary very strongly data-focused approach to a focus where we want to look at what we think lies at the heart of quality of education, which is curriculum, what children learn, what they're taught. So the other purpose of research for us is to kind of give a nudge and give information to the sectors that we inspect. So one of our tasks as an inspectorate is to inform the Secretary of State and the system about quality of education. That sometimes means that it is very useful for us to use the information that we have, and we have a lot of information, of course, about schools, about early years providers, about colleges, and to aggregate that and to provide that broader overview, that bird's eye view of the system. And that we do, for example, through our annual reports, where we sort of collate everything we have found out over the past year.
And just going back to the EIF, in March at the Heads Forward School Leadership Summit, Amanda Spielman said that feedback around the new framework had been largely positive.
Yes.
Is that something you would echo, and to what extent is that attributed to the research that went into creating that new framework?
So yeah, that's certainly what we are picking up. We also picked that up in our evaluation work. So mainly positive feedback with, of course, some tweaks that we might want to make or something that people are less happy with, but overwhelmingly positive. Is that down to the research? Well, certainly in part, I think it is. I think that research has helped us do two things. Firstly, it has helped clarify what things are really important when you're looking, for example, at curriculum. It has also, I think, helped us test out a number of ideas before even we started to pilot them. So we've been able to kind of build up and iterate the process of developing the education inspection framework over time, which I think has been really helpful. And also, I think by doing the research and publishing the research reports, I think that's been helpful to the sector, because it's given schools and school leaders a little bit of an insight into our thinking and the kind of things that we're feeding into the development of the framework.
Go on, after you.
And we've kind of tried to replicate that process also, for example, when we developed the ITE inspection framework. Again, we did a piece of research beforehand, we did a lot of piloting, we published the research findings. So a similar kind of process, because we think that works.
And you hinted at maybe a few things that maybe could be tweaked. I'll be neglecting my duty to not ask, do you have those in mind, and is there a timeline for those tweaks?
So obviously we are looking at a range of, we've already done a number of things. For example, we consulted with the sector around what was the best way of looking at small schools. Obviously, we have now had a long period of kind of pausing of inspections, and we will not be back to normal EIF inspections till at least the new year. So we are using that time to kind of obviously look at the evaluation findings, look at the other feedback we get, and see whether there are any tweaks that we need and want to do to EIF when we introduce it. But we're not kind of rushing that process. We want to make sure we get that right.
Great. So you mentioned a kind of range of different studies and research focuses. One of the things that I picked up on from back in January was the focus around stuck schools.
Oh, yes.
And the fact that 210,000 pupils were identified as being in a school that was either chaotic or had some form of change fatigue or a resistant culture. I know that obviously the world in January pre-COVID was very different. We're able to summarize some of the key findings and maybe how that might play out in the future.
Okay, so maybe first helpful just to say that we define a stuck school specifically as a school that has been less than good for at least 13 years, so on a rolling basis. So that's a long time. And of course, because the schools were less than good, they will typically have been inspected quite a number of times within that 13-year period. What we did in the research was to match a group of schools that were stuck with a group of very similar schools that had become unstuck, so that had improved to good and had stayed good. So we wanted to make sure that they'd been good at least in 2 subsequent inspections.
Right.
And then we had a look at what differentiates those schools. So what has made some schools come out of that situation where others are still stuck. And essentially we find that 3 main things appear to have made a difference. The first one is around upholding high teaching standards. So focusing really quite strongly on the quality of teaching, the quality of education, through professional development. A lot of schools have actually specifically mentioned using the teaching standards, for example. The second thing we find is that those schools that had become unstuck had focused strongly on getting behaviour right, so making sure that you had consistent policies in place which were consistently applied, establishing high expectations, and also understanding clearly that behaviour doesn't just matter for pupils, but that it matters for teachers. So if you want to retain good teachers, and that's often a challenge for schools working in the most difficult circumstances, then getting behaviour right is important. And the third thing we found is that the schools that had improved had been very well supported by their multi-academy trust. So the multi-academy trust was very active in sharing knowledge and experience, providing challenge and insight, and in particular, the advantage in those mats was that they could provide a balance of support that was understanding of the context of the school, because the mat knows the schools, but also has enough distance and enough oversight and accountability to kind of give that challenge. And sometimes when you look at external support for schools, it is a little bit one or the other. Either you have real insiders who understand the context really well, but don't necessarily always give enough challenge. So that's kind of, so those were some of the main things that we found there. In terms of where we are now, of course, we have done a number of inspections of stuck schools under EIF, but of course those stopped in March. We have seen a number of schools improve from RI or inadequate in those inspections, not an insignificant proportion, and we have been doing some work looking at the inspection reports of those schools to try and find out more about why that group of schools has now improved under EIF, and we hope to be reporting on that soon, so that analysis is ongoing.
Great. And you mentioned the importance of behaviour, particularly around students. and also that concept of high support and high challenge needed
Yep.
for an organisation. I just wondered what your thoughts are around behaviour and whole school behaviour management practice. Are Ofsted looking at any research around how to best manage behaviour in such challenging circumstances?
So we did a piece of work on behaviour last year, which where we looked at where we found things like the importance of making sure that teachers are supported by senior management in implementing policies. Also, the importance of explicitly teaching pupils the behaviours you are expecting of them, and not just assuming that just by having policies and rules in place, kids will actually know what that means. Also, as I said earlier, the importance of consistency, but within that, of course, an element of flexibility for kids, for example, with specific needs or specific circumstances. We were actually intending to do quite a large piece of follow-up research on that, but that was one of the pieces of research that kind of got parked because of COVID.
And at Centre for Social Justice, we did a teacher tap survey, and that found that there was a higher percentage of primary school teachers who were saying that they explicitly teach how to behave compared to secondary school teachers. Is that something that you've come across, and what can we do to address the balance?
Yeah, I think that is something that we see as well. I think that is maybe a slight misconception that once you get secondary, that's no longer necessary. And I think certainly what we saw in our research is that some of the schools who seem to be doing best were very focused on that transition period from primary to secondary, and what do we do to kind of acculturate kids coming from primary into what is now expected of them in the larger kind of secondary context, sometimes by doing some work with them before they even started secondary school. So I think it's about making sure that people are aware that you can't just assume that because a kid has been in primary school that they know what's expected of them in secondary school. So we still need to teach that. And of course, we need to take into account that as we go kind of through adolescence, we know that's quite a turbulent developmental period for young people. So again, there's obviously going to be a need to kind of address the issues that come from that and work with kids.
Really interesting. And you briefly mentioned ITE earlier on. Are you able to share a bit more detail around the research done in that space?
Sure, yes. So what we did in the ITE research was kind of slightly parallel to the curriculum research we did in schools, and is again linked to the development of the ITE inspection framework. So we felt that it was time, seeing as we had developed EIF, to look again at how we were inspecting ITE. Firstly, because we felt that it would make sense to ensure that there is some alignment between the two, so that like EIF, the ITE framework focuses on the substance of education. It was a good time to do that because we'd reached the end of the current inspection cycle. Also, we want to make sure that we aligned with other work happening in the sector, like the new core content framework and the new early careers framework, both developed by the DFE. So we did a relatively extensive piece of research consisting first of a literature review and then of visits to a range of IT providers, quite a relatively large sample of providers. I'm just finding the numbers now. There were 46 partnerships we visited. And what we found there was the kind of importance of three key elements. So the first of those is partnership working. So the way that the kind of center, say for example, if it's an HE-led provider, the university or whatever, works with partner schools, or the way the Centre Skit works with its schools, and how they kind of work together to plan and deliver a well-sequenced curriculum. That
Sure.
idea of being well-sequenced obviously is very similar to what we find in EIF.
Yeah.
We also see that it's really important to look at how those partnerships work with mentors, how mentors are trained for their role, and again, it's about making sure that it's a genuine kind of co-construction between the two. We also, second factor was kind of curriculum planning. So things like, again, sequencing of curriculum, understanding the learning process, and not least the fact that trainees are novice teachers. So therefore, you need to treat them as novices and not as experts. Making sure that you don't try to capture every possible thing in a kind of bite-sized chunk just to ensure coverage of the teacher standards.
Okay.
Think about what you're doing, think about how it builds on each other. Also, we found that in terms of how we actually conduct inspections, it's really important that we speak to mentors and not least that we speak to trainees, and that of course has certain implications, because if you say it's really key to speak to trainees, and there are obvious reasons why that's the case, you need to think about when you're actually doing the inspections. If you inspect an IT provider in September, your trainees is not going to be able to tell you very much about the provision they've had, because they won't have experienced very much. So so again, we're looking at, okay, when is the right time to actually go into IT providers? That's probably later in the year rather than earlier.
Interesting. Okay, and would there be scope for also speaking to those who have been through the ITE process and have then gained qualifications, to be able to talk about their journey and experience, or is it very much just looking at those who are currently on that training program?
So ideally, you also want to try and get the views of people who have experienced the training program in the past. That's done, for example, we do that now on through NQT surveys, for example. Of course, that's easier said than done in terms of making sure you actually reach people. But yes, in principle, that's important.
Sure. And linking back to what we spoke about earlier on around stuck schools, to what extent have you found that the context of a placement school has an impact on a trainee's experience while they're training to be a teacher?
That's absolutely important. So so there's two things to say there. Firstly, it is important that trainees do experience a certain variety of context in their training. So obviously what we don't just want to produce trainees who can teach in a particular school. We want trainees who can work across, hopefully, different contexts and schools. But secondly, what we find is really important is the alignment between the partnership and the IT program and the actual school that the placement is in. One of the problems that we found in some cases is that the IT provider wants to look, say, at a subject and look at a certain curriculum in that, but the school actually doesn't let the trainee practice that because they want them to follow their own particular curriculum. So again, there's a need for that dialogue and that co-construction between the IT provision and the partnership schools or the placement schools to make sure that you don't get that kind of mismatch between the two.
Wow, great. So there are clearly a number of areas of research that have been carried out or planned and are going on already at the moment. How, internally within Ofsted, because Ofsted is a large organisation, how is that research being translated and filtered down across the organisation to inspectors and those who work in other roles?
Okay, so that happens in a number of ways. So firstly, we've done a whole series of internal webinars for all Ofsted staff about our different research projects. So that you could call the direct way. We also obviously publicize internally when we publish reports, etc.
Yeah.
But I think probably the most impactful way is that it feeds into inspector training.
Right.
So when we do the research, for example, on curriculum, that's then used as part of the material that informs inspector training. So when we introduced the EIF, obviously we went through a big program of inspector training alongside that, and part of that was to get them to also understand the research, what lies behind that. So that you don't kind of just say, okay, this is the framework, this is what you do, but that people have a real understanding of why we're doing it this way, what is the basis for that, and so on. So that's kind of a big way in which we internally disseminate.
Great. And is that kind of like optional modules that inspectors can do as to top up from their kind of core program? How does it work?
So there's a core, there is a compulsory training program that all inspectors have to follow. So it would normally be part of that. Right, so, great. And obviously that is for us, obviously, as an organisation, very important, because we want to make sure that we are valid and reliable in what we do, and therefore we need to give proper high quality training to people.
Definitely. So it's nearly the end of August. Some schools have gone back already, and some are going back in the next few days and weeks. What's the autumn going to look like from Ofsted's point of view? And what do schools need to be aware of?
So, of course, as you know, when we went into lockdown, we suspended all inspection activity, and we other than like necessary regulatory activity. However, in September, from kind of late September onwards, we are intending to go back into not inspections, but school visits. Okay. That's an important distinction, because what we want to do with the visits is to try and help parents, government and the public understand how education is getting back on its feet. So we are not going in with the full education inspection framework. Importantly, we are not grading schools, so we are not using our 4-point grading scale. Rather, what we are doing is carrying out collaborative visits, which we hope are supportive and based on dialogue with the schools and with the providers that we are going into. Okay. So the outcome of those visits will not be an inspection report. There will be a short descriptive letter to that just describes what we have discussed and what the school is doing, but there will be no judgment associated with that. Okay. And there will be a number of summary thematic reports that that we will be producing as kind of research outputs that will describe how the system is doing, not for individual providers, but system-wide. So how are schools doing, how are early years providers doing, how are colleges and further education providers doing. Yeah. We'll be producing kind of 3 briefing notes that give you hopefully a quick summary of what's happening, and then thematic reports early in the new year. Okay,
so no inspection reports, but there will be letters. Yes. Will they be publicly available, or are they direct to the schools themselves?
So the intention is that, so we are currently still consulting on that, and we'll be piloting, but the intention is that they will be publicly available.
Interesting. But there won't be a grading system as is in
no grades and no evaluative judgments.
Okay. I'm really interested to ask, during kind of the lead up to the summer break, there was a lot of talk around academic catch-up and the importance of supporting students to catch up, for want of a better phrase, with any learning that might have been lost during lockdown. Will this be a focus of inspection of visits in autumn, or will there be more of a greater focus on the social emotional learning side and the support that schools might be giving to students?
So we will certainly be looking at CatchUp and what schools are doing to support learning amongst pupils. So that's one of the things we will be reporting on in the briefing notes. Okay. But essentially what we'll be doing is holding conversations with with school leaders about what they have been doing. So in most cases that will probably be addressing learning loss, but also addressing social and emotional needs. So we'll probably be talking about both those things when we report later on.
And how important do you think social and emotional learning is at this time?
Well, that's actually that's not as easy a question as is sometimes assumed, because we don't really know to what extent kids have suffered social and emotional difficulties in this period. The evidence that we have on that today, which is not Ofsted's own evidence, but pieces of research that other organisations have done, is actually quite mixed. So there's obviously reports looking at things like greater loneliness, etc., amongst young people, as you can imagine. But there's also there was a report out from Bristol University earlier this week, for example, which suggested that anxiety levels had actually decreased amongst 13 to 15-year-olds during lockdown. So it's a complex picture, I think, and I think it will be we'll have to kind of wait and see what schools actually are confronted with in terms of social and emotional needs of their pupils when they go back in. Also, we shouldn't underestimate the positive potential impact of being back with friends and peers and in the kind of day-to-day environment of the school. So that in itself could be a kind of protective factor. So I think it's a little bit wait and see on that one. But and say at the moment, kind of mixed evidence on that.
Yeah, and I really like what you said in terms of it's going to be a mixed picture. Every young person is unique, and whether that be their home life, the support they've received, how they've been impacted by COVID-19, even within one school class, could be greatly different across the cohort. So, yeah, I guess an importance for schools to be addressing that and identifying what the needs are and then supporting them appropriately.
Yeah, and the same is really true around things like learning loss as well. Again, that will differ quite significantly depending on the amount of support and learning kids have done at home, for example. And we know, and again, some of the studies that have been done on that suggest that that can again vary quite significantly from some kids almost kind of being permanently homeschooled to other kids whose parents haven't been able to do that and who haven't really done much in terms of home learning at all. So again, you'll see quite a lot of diversity when schools restart.
Definitely. So just to wrap up on the area of visits for autumn, and I guess and beyond, perhaps, depending on what situation we're in, is there any areas or focuses that head teachers should pay greater attention to as they prepare or expect a visit such as the ones you've described?
So we don't have any kind of things that we are expecting schools to do. As I say, it's not an inspection, so it's very much for us a little bit of a fact-finding mission. We want to find out what schools are doing, what they have done, so that we can also learn from that. We can inform the system about that. So there isn't really any need for schools to prepare in any specific way for this or to do anything specific. For Ofsted, it really is a visit where we're just coming to find out, speak to you, find out what you've done. Let's say we are not using the framework, so there's no specific expectation around that.
So it could be really interesting in terms of the learning and the feedback and the findings that you get as a result of those inspections. Certainly it's not something that's been done before in this format.
No, indeed.
So hopefully it will give us some really constructive findings, really.
Yeah, and let's say the intention from us is to learn and report on the system as a whole and not on individual schools.
Yeah, definitely. So there's going to be that work that's going to be ongoing. What else is on the horizon for Ofsted?
So in terms of our research work, another kind of big piece of work that we're starting is subject reviews.
Right.
So Obviously, in EIF, with the focus on curriculum comes, of course, a great focus on subjects. And as you'll know, the deep dives on inspection
Yeah.
look at a number of specific subjects. Of course, that is going to give us really, really interesting information about kind of the state of the nation in, say, science or music or whatever subject we're talking about. And our intention is to start producing subject reviews that report on the state of the art in the subject, and the idea is to make those helpful to subject leaders so they can kind of find out about what sort of is some really strong practice going on in the subject, for example. We're underpinning those all with thorough literature reviews. So we think about what quality looks like in the different subjects, not just at the generic level. In some ways, it's a little bit of a return to work that Ofsted used to do. Lots of people remember a kind of subject reviews we did in the past. We stopped doing that for a while, but we feel that with EIF, now's the time. Now we once again, in our inspections, looking at subject curriculum to report back to the sector, hopefully in a useful and helpful way.
That's really interesting.
And obviously, that work will kind of fully restart once the regular inspections restart.
Sure. And I saw that you were tweeting recently about music and the value and importance of it. Yeah, have you got anything to touch on in terms of the arts and that broad balanced curriculum?
Yeah, so really what I was trying to say is that sometimes we kind of feel that we have to justify curriculum subjects, in particular those which are kind of not English or maths, by reference to either the generic skills that we're going to pick up from them, or the fact that they are going to make us better readers or better at maths. And I actually think that's a real shame, because when you are talking about a rich and broad curriculum, that is about giving your pupils the chance to access the wealth, the richness of knowledge across different areas, so across science, across arts. And to me, you don't need to justify the value of music or of any other curriculum subjects because, say, it's going to help you read better, or it's going to help you do better maths. And there's been that's one of the things that people have said about music. Whether it does or does not, to me, is not really the key thing. Those subjects are valuable in and of themselves. They will enrich the life of the children that we bring them into contact with. They will make sure that we develop a broad understanding of the world. And I think it's actually really quite important that scientists understand a bit about arts and humanities, and arts and humanities graduates understand a bit about science as well, because we live in a complex world. We are asked, for example, as voters, to make decisions about those kind of things. So that broad understanding, to me, that's really important.
Great. Yeah, and I'm sure that will be music to many a music teacher's ears, who, you know, kind of wanting to stress the importance of that, as you say, not just because it helps in other areas.
No, exactly. I mean, music and other arts are just valuable in and of themselves because they enrich our lives. They make us, I think, better human beings. So.
Sure. And do you think there's a risk at all, just as we come to a close, that schools maybe turn away or turn to focus more on English and maths in the wake of COVID-19?
Of course, that's one of the discussions that has been ongoing. To what extent do you, in terms of catch-up, focus more on those core subjects? I mean, so I would say it would be regrettable if we lose the kind of breadth of curriculum. I mean, obviously, I understand that catching up on core subjects is really important, but let's not forget that there's more to children's education than English and maths, actually. And we know also that knowledge of different areas matters also in terms of accessing the full curriculum. So I would kind of advocate, yes, of course, English and maths are really important and you need to address that, but let's not throw everything else under the bus for that.
Sure. I think that's a really great point to end on. Daniel, thank you very much for your time and for sharing some insights from yourself and from Ofsted's point of view. Hope you have a great rest of the summer and a good next academic year.
Thank you.